Hi, it's Theory Thursday. What are we going to talk about today? Sweet spots. What's the best wattage or temperature, or best place to have yourself set for any particular tank, dripper, whatever, and why? So let's talk about that. Okay, sweet spots. What that really basically refers to is that there's a range that any given setup should be used in. There's such a thing as too low and too high, and that's just a hard, fast fact of physics. There's no device out there yet that has just an infinite range in both directions. If you usually generally are running too low, you'll be running too cool. You won't be heating the coil up enough, so you won't be vaporizing all the juice out of there, and it's very characteristic. You'll get flooding and gurgling, a lot of juice coming out of the airflow holes and stuff like that. And see that a lot with people who get sub-ohm tanks that are maybe a little too rowdy for them, and they try to tone the numbers down and down and down, and eventually just wind up coil can't even handle all that juice coming in and not going up the drip tip like it's supposed to, getting vaporized. So it just starts to gurgle and really makes a mess fast. So be sensible when you're picking your setups, because there is such a thing as just too rowdy. And even if it's really cool, there's kind of an acclimation process that some folks, just the throat hit, the amount of vapor that's produced, they just can't, it's too much for them, so they need to ratchet that back, so then they wind up kind of cooling it off too much. Same thing with going too hot. There is definitely such a thing as too high. That'll wind up with burnt coils, burnt tastes. Behind the scenes, you're actually creating a little formaldehyde. That's what that funky taste is not very good chemistry. So the amount of energy that's added at that point can actually change the state of the juice, and definitely not a good thing and what you not want to do. So running it too hot is pretty much what it says is. You get a lot of spit back up the drip tip. You'll get kind of a sizzling sound. You may get juice shooting out in different directions where you don't want it, maybe out the airflow holes on the dripper. So yeah, it's not necessarily inherently dangerous in and of itself, but it does shorten the life of everything, and it's definitely the worst case scenario for your batteries to really be crunching on those every time you fire. So the too high and too hot definitely speaks for itself. But how do you know that? Most of it's going to be the resistance and the coil design, but the other key kind of hidden factor is airflow and how much airflow you actually apply during that process. So you get a big rowdy coil, but you just kind of take a real slow, tame vape, or try to even mouth along it, regardless of what your airflow setting is. You're not pulling enough air over the coil to keep it cool, and so it can actually start to overheat in that sense too. So depending on where you have your settings and what numbers you are kind of hoping for, you need to, again, with the tank situation especially, generate the amount of airflow that system actually expects to get everything to work properly. So if you do like kind of a smaller airflow or more of a mouth to lung, getting something that's designed for a big giant lung head and trying to tame it down again, that creates kind of the same problems. There needs to be a kind of a certain amount of airflow there to cool that coil off. Now the smaller coils are also generally a higher resistance, which will also kind of translate into a pretty simple relationship. Higher resistances, lower wattages, lower resistances, higher wattages. And so they're kind of a seesaw, and it's kind of easy to remember. But as the resistance goes up, generically, they expect you to run them at lower and lower numbers or temperatures. Now, each coil design is a little bit different, and I've seen some where that's exactly the opposite. So that's not a hard, fast rule. Most coils these days are coming with a stamping on them to tell you where to start off. Go by that number, but it is just a recommendation. So kind of season to taste and pick a flavor and an experience that you enjoy within that range, hopefully as best as possible. But don't just necessarily use that as the beat-all, end-all. But that gives you an idea when you're starting to get out of whack in either direction. But the resistance is going to be a lot of it, and the airflow is going to be a lot of it. So a higher resistance coil with less airflow, definitely going to be a lower number and a lot less power required to generate the same heat, because there's just less things trying to cool that coil off. Conversely, something with a lot of airflow and a big old coil, definitely going to need a lot of power to heat it up. So you're going to definitely be running in the higher numbers. Now, a lot of tank manufacturers, especially tank manufacturers, have coil options that are in different resistances to let you pick those numbers that kind of make sense for you. And What that really means is, again, they'll offer kind of different resistances with different recommendations to let you go on the higher end or the lower end. So hopefully any reputable helper will kind of explain that to you when you're buying one. But temperature tends to be a little bit more personal. You can go in very small increments, and there again, season to taste, but that tends to be more of a personal decision. And most folks that are in that setting kind of have a handle on what's going on, but in general there, you don't want to just blow away the coil and then wait for temp control to pull the wattage back and monitor it that way. You can nuke a coil before the temp control kicks in, and I've had problems with that myself. Wires burning out before the power pulls back, and so my build is fried even though the temp control is actually working perfectly. I just nailed it with 250 watts and then dialed it back on a sub tank. Yeah, that's probably a little too much. So be sensible with your numbers, but with the temp control, go in small changes, but you're mostly going to be changing the flavor versus the experience. The underlying experience is still going to be the wattage or the joule setting, and I find joules to actually be more of a true temperature, warmer, cooler type, basically back to old wattage days, than I actually do find the temp control in a lot of the DNA type series. I find those to be very taste oriented, and the vapor is kind of always going to be at the maximum, which is kind of good actually. But different mods will have different experiences with that, and so finding a sweet spot with that's a little bit trickier. But underlying on the wattage, still kind of stick to what makes sense. And most of them have lower resistance coils, so you think you could just blow them away with tons and tons of power, but there again, that's where the airflow and the design of the tank really comes into play. A smaller, more mouth to lung focused tank, or one that's even capable of it, will definitely not run at a higher underlying wattage regardless of what your temperature settings are. So kind of start with pretend it's a wattage coil, go by that, and then set a temperature to taste. That's probably my best, recommendation there. But with wattage, it's a little bit simpler. Just kind of start in the middle of what they recommend for the coil manufacturers. A lot of folks, especially with the rowdier coils, like to start lower and kind of break a new coil in. I do recommend that. Just kind of go to the lower third of their recommended wattage and then work your way up. And when you hit your breaking point, whether you or the coil comes first, that's when it's time to stop and stay there, maybe even pull it back a little bit. Other thing that kind of goes with this is resistance plays directly into battery life. So if you just want to see bigger numbers, that's great, but just keep in mind you're going to be crunching through those batteries faster just because more electrons get through that coil every time you fire, and so that you only have so many electrons in that battery, and every time you use that firing button, so lower resistances mean more can get through every time you fire. So that just is your choice, and that's why actually the engineers would rather you stayed on the higher resistances and lower wattages to generate that same amount of heat. But there again, it depends how much airflow you're using to pull that down. So your choice on where you want to go with that, but maybe hopefully that'll help zero you in on some of the factors. And if nothing else, vape safely and have an awesome day.